Good evening, folks. I'm Andy Durstein, Clinical Director at Onward Transitions, and welcome to our Thursday, August 20th edition of the Parent Forum. I'm joined tonight by Austin Melhorn, our Program Director and fellow clinician. And as we're approaching the beginning of the college school year in all kinds of different formats this year, we thought it would be a good time to spend the evening talking about executive functioning and touch a bit on ADHD and the implications that all that has on being a college student. We often think of executive function as organizational skills and time management, and those are two very important executive function subcategories, but there are a number of others. So we thought we'd spend some time going over that this evening. And so I'm going to turn this over to Austin, who will lead the presentation tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. So y'all should now see 8 executive functions, a little sheet put up there to help you follow along. And depending on where you go looking for this kind of information, the executive functions may be organized slightly differently. Breaking it down into 8 here, one, it was a nice visual, and two, kind of breaking it down further might make it a little easier to kind of piece out some of those other parts. So I'm just going to go through each of these, talk briefly about them, and then we'll move on to talking more specifically to how they relate and their deficits within ADHD. So self-control, the ability to stop and think before acting. Self-monitoring, the ability to view and evaluate oneself, kind of, you think of those as almost kind of like mindful self-observation skills, and sometimes those will be clumped together depending on what model you're looking at. Emotional control, the ability to kind of know what you're feeling, especially manage those feelings in the moment. To achieve complete tasks. Sometimes those three will all kind of be lumped together as well, depending on which model you're looking at. And they definitely have, a lot to do with one another. It's tough to have emotional control without having some self-monitoring skills to really kind of have that self-awareness of what's going on within yourself in the moment. Flexibility, the ability to adapt to changing conditions, changing plans, revising strategies, as it goes to coursework, if a professor changes something on the syllabus, decides to change how something might be graded, change the structure of the class in some way, perhaps you were going to classes in person and then you were going to classes, all remotely. That's, a huge change in how that's getting, processed in the brain, and having flexibility there can be really challenging if you're not feeling or not somebody that has that kind of strength. Task initiation, simply put, getting started, taking that first step on an assignment, on a paper, on a reading. Without this, you find that procrastination is the piece that comes in, and is certainly very common within that population. Organization, the ability to develop systems, track materials and information. That might have a lot to do with, organizing various classes and maintaining, kind of an order through the semester, to organizing a outline for a paper and following through with that. Working memory, the ability to use information held in memory to complete a task. A lot of times it can be helpful to kind of think of that as the memory, the amount of information you're kind of able to hold on to and access while trying to complete one task. So with deficits within working memory, single tasks can become very overwhelming if you're having trouble maintaining that information that you need to write the paper without having to consistently look back at the source material, perhaps. And then planning and time management, the ability to create steps to reach a goal, understanding and being able to accurately predict how long those steps are going to take you, putting them in order, prioritizing. And again, we'll go back to, the idea of a syllabus, a whole semester, and being able to look at the work that's needed to be done, when it needs to get done, and then how long that's going to take you from reading, source material, finding citations perhaps, creating an outline, and then writing a paper. Being able to plan all those steps, predict how long they'll take, and being able to start that process is a really important piece to being a successful student, and can be really challenging when there are deficits. So going from there, and Andy, please feel free to interrupt with any smart
Sure.
words.
I don't know how smart they are, but let me offer a couple of examples. So self-monitoring, being able to pay attention to oneself, one's emotional state. So part of getting started on a project, for example, there's this signal anxiety. We talk about anxiety a lot, and sort of gets a bad rap. But there are times where anxiety is adaptive, and signal anxiety is one of those times. It's like, oh, yeah, I got to get on this thing, or I'm going to run out of time to do it. So that signals us to start the project. And so there, in this case, self-monitoring is very much related to task initiation and emotional regulation. Part of emotional regulation as it relates to school and school tasks is distress tolerance. The ability to stick with something that's tedious, that you'll often hear, is boring, but requires sustained effort. And so that's an important piece in all of this. It's not just impulsivity or short attention span. Some of it is just that challenge with regulating and tolerating some of the difficult emotions that might come along with that. With task initiation, again, if you have a child with some executive function deficits, as Austin said, that task initiation, kind of the opposite of that, is procrastination. And what you see is, rather than responding to kind of the signal anxiety and planning ahead and mapping out how long it's going to take, all those other skills, they tend to rely on that 11th hour stimulation. I got this paper due tomorrow. I do my best work last minute. So, we see them relying on that, oh man, I got to get this done because it's due tomorrow, as a way of stimulating them to get the work done. And sometimes that works fine, but other times, there's just not enough hours in that last day to get the project done. So you can kind of see how all these things tie together. Another example, working memory, just a very simple example of this. If that information is readily available, so like, what's the square root of 81? If you've got that stored in your working memory, and 9 is right there for you, you've exerted very little mental energy and very little processing speed in order to calculate that. So you can work more quickly and more efficiently. But if you have working memory deficits, now you're tapping into processing speed and tapping into doing calculations instead of just drawing on it. So you can see how all these things can play together and can contribute to just a feeling of really being dragged down at times. And I think people with executive function weaknesses will describe that a lot. I feel like I'm reasonably bright, but I just cannot kind of get through this work. So that's my piece in that, Austin.
Yeah, I like that last piece especially, because a lot of times these students might get through lots of schooling all the way through high school, pretty bright and able to kind of get by without needing to really focus on honing some of these executive functioning tasks. Writing papers the night beforehand, completing work in that fashion. Because they are bright, but there are some specific deficits that can really end up dragging them down, and they might be then getting ready to go off to college, having their first semester, something like that, and some of those deficits get highlighted more and more, and there's far fewer supports, or perhaps they're accessing supports less, not aware that they need these supports, and becoming quickly overwhelmed.
Right. Yeah. Typically, these bright young folks, do pretty well up until they don't. At some point the rubber hits the road, and they can't rely just on that native intelligence, because all these other things have to come in to play to be able to really harness that intellectual horsepower. And frequently it's when they go off to college, and we see some of this stuff really take hold. The other piece also I wanted to mention around time management. In order to have time management, you have to have time awareness, and the opposite of time awareness is time blindness. And so frequently, we're working with folks, and they just have no idea really of what time of day it is, how long they just spent on a project, how much time is going to be required. So sometimes it just comes down to some really basic strategies, like wear a wristwatch, put a big clock on the wall in the room where you study, so that you have more awareness of time, and therefore you'll be better able to do and plan for time management.
Yeah. So next, I'm gonna break down some of these things. A couple of things we already kind of you already provided some great examples to, and dig into them a little bit more, kind of into some different clusters. So first, I'm gonna start with the kind of cluster of activation executive functioning skills. So this kind of brings together the ideas of organizing, prioritizing, starting on tasks, and in terms of prioritizing and organizing, definitely time management is included in that. So I will also say it's important to note we're probably gonna reference school work a lot, because the semester is about to get started here for the fall. But outside of that, any task, anything that these folks might be trying to achieve, be it a job application, setting up a doctor's appointment, whatever the case may be, these executive functionings will have an impact in all of these areas. So organization, prioritizing, getting started on tasks. Somebody with ADHD might, in my experience, that getting started on tasks is really, really challenging. I've worked with a number of young folks who, once they get started on a task, they tend to be pretty good at, continuing with it, especially some of these, bright folks who might not have as bad of deficits within their working memory. And that's again, an important kind of piece I guess I should note before we get too much further into this, is that somebody with ADHD or any other kind of executive functioning challenge, they might have some pretty specific deficits in some areas. We're going to talk about them all, but some folks might just have a couple of deficits, but then be very strong in other areas. And those, those discrepancies can be all the more frustrating at times. So, getting started on tasks. How do we help folks get started on tasks when they're really struggling with taking that first step? Some things that we at Onward Transitions will do is helping to go ahead and organize the semester or the classwork that needs to get done that week, organizing them and breaking it down into smaller steps, smaller chunks that are a little bit easier to conceptualize, plan, and understand how long they will take. Those folks who have frequently gotten by writing papers at the 11th hour, they've been successful in that perhaps, or gotten by that way perhaps, but that's certainly almost not going to be the best way they're going to get work done. It just happens to be the way they've gotten it done because getting started on tasks has been hard. So waiting until the pressure builds up to go ahead and write it the night before has worked for them, but getting started a week before, can be really challenging. Within schools, there's usually resources like tutors or study groups that, folks should really think about using as a resource. Even just a friend that's in the class, or a friend that's not even in the class, but you get together to study or do work at the same time. That can be a lot easier way to get started on a task than just having that internal motivation that frankly might not be there because that task initiation is really challenging. Organizing and prioritizing can be skills that can be practiced that can help with task initiation. Those two items are a little bit more concrete. You can write out a calendar, you can work with somebody to help understand how long a task might take, how long it's taken in the past. But the act of task initiation is less of a skill to be worked on or written down. It's something that can be supported or really practiced over time. Anything else you might like to add on some of those activation skills, Andy?
Yeah, I think here at Onward, we have coaches that meet with our emerging adults every day, and one of their tasks for for our members who are students is to identify, okay, so what are the assignments that you have coming up in the next week or two? And then breaking it down, chunking out the tasks associated with that, because this is another piece that is difficult for them. And then breaking down daily goals. So, okay, today you're going to write the outline for that paper you're going to write. And then we check in with them the next day to make sure that they have followed through with that. So there are those touch points just to make sure that they're staying on track with it. Some of it is helping them, that part of the initiation is just organizing their study space. Don't sit on your couch with, your laptop open and, Netflix playing and all those sorts of things and expect that you're going to be highly productive in getting work done. Create a space that is going to be efficient and effective, whether that's cleaning off your kitchen table or maybe getting a smaller desk in your bedroom that's devoted to studying. So, we're helping them kind of create a more productive space as well as part of that getting started.
Yeah, and that leads really well into the next piece too, which is kind of a cluster focused around focusing, maintaining, and shifting attention. It can be really tough to focus and maintain attention when there are distractions around. A lot of people, or I shouldn't say a lot of people, but I've certainly heard frequently folks say, it's easier for me to work with the TV on. And, again, I find that often is more, well, that's how you may have done it. That may have sometimes alleviated some of your discomfort with getting work done. But, I seriously doubt that that's a great focusing tool. Now, caveats there. Somebody might have, on a show they've watched 1,000 times, a musical with music that they enjoy, something to that effect. But for the most part, having a far more deliberate working space to stay and maintain focused, is probably going to be more conducive. Dedicated study space, as Andy was just saying. Perhaps getting out of the apartment, coming over to one of our program locations and sitting down to have that dedicated study space. I'm here, this is where I do the work. I go home, I don't do the work there. It can be helpful to kind of differentiate those spaces. Maintaining focus can be, certainly tough with somebody with, attention deficit disorder. That's kind of right in the name there. Oftentimes taking very deliberate breaks, and by deliberate, I mean, timed, what you do with that break in between is important, not necessarily just turning on a show for 30 minutes, which, not to say that's necessarily a bad thing, but often perhaps getting up, moving your body, maybe that's a good time to grab a snack or something like that, giving your focused attention a break and then coming back. There's certainly some great research to show that, taking 15-minute breaks every hour can be more productive than sitting down and trying to do something for 3 hours without a break. And then shifting attention. And this might kind of hone in on what you choose to do in your study time and how you choose to do it. You might not want to write an English paper while you're trying to work on some math problems. Might not be the best way to kind of shift your attention and use your brain in the most efficient way. But also perhaps when it comes down to writing a paper and you're shifting between referencing source material and writing the paper, some people might work very well shifting their attention back and forth. Some people might really struggle with that, especially if they have deficits in that kind of in that area of shifting attention, which can sometimes be really tough for folks with ADD. So, a solution there might be to, create an outline using your source material, or read the source material and perhaps put sticky notes in areas that you later want to put into the paper, which will probably help with some of that working memory deficit later on as you're writing the paper. Instead of having to try to access what's there, you've written out, you've created a hard copy of your working memory.
Right. Yeah. So the issue of shift ties back into that flexibility. And if you've been raising a young adult child with ADHD, you also raised a younger child with ADHD. And one of the bigger challenges is that shift and flexibility. They sort of lock into the activity that they're doing and have a hard time switching gears. So you give them the 10-minute warning, you give them the 5-minute warning, and they still can't disengage from whatever the high interest thing was that they were doing when you wanted them to stop doing it and get in the car to go to school. And, so they face similar challenges in the academic arena. So, that work for 45 minutes, take a 15-minute break is a really good strategy, as long as you're self-disciplined about the end of the 15-minute break, because that sort of same thing can slip back in where I'm, for 15 minutes, I'm going to turn on, something on Netflix, and before you know it, 2 hours has passed. So it's important to structure the breaks, sometimes just setting alarms so that there's a prompt for you to get back on track can be helpful.
Yeah. See our next little cluster. Effort, regulating alertness, sustaining effort, and processing speed. Sustaining effort, especially if it's not a high interest activity, that can be really, really challenging, kind of as Andy was just talking about. And then processing speed, and this is a piece that Andy can speak to, the kind of the discrepancies, and he spoke to it a little bit earlier. But oftentimes we have folks that sound really smart, and they are really smart, and they have really really high scores in certain areas of their IQ, but end up testing lower in their processing speed. And those discrepancies can be hard to notice for teachers and students and parents as folks are moving through lower grades. They can kind of get by with that natural brightness, and then processing speeds can really kind of slow that down. It can feel really frustrating when these students are finding that they're really struggling in college and they don't necessarily understand why. And Andy, if you want to maybe speak to some of those discrepancies in scores that we see, with members that come through the program, I think that'd be great.
Sure. So just briefly, if your children or young adult children have had some neuropsych testing, they would have had a Wechsler intelligence scale, the IQ test. So there are basically 4 subcategories of that: verbal intelligence, performance IQ, working memory, and processing speed. And the more typical profile that we see with our members is they have very high verbal intelligence. Average intelligence is 100. We're frequently seeing 130, 140 in the verbal IQ. More often, their performance IQ is a little bit lower. And then what we tend to see is working memory and processing speed sometimes significantly lower. Ideally, what you want to see is a cluster of pretty close scores. What we sometimes see are discrepancies between particularly verbal intelligence and processing speed of sometimes 60 or 70 points. And that's huge. And so what happens is they present, because they are bright verbally, they present very bright. And so people tend to overestimate their abilities because they come across so well. But what they don't recognize is how much energy they're having to put into processing information. It's sort of like the analogy of a funnel with sand coming through it. If the sand is new information, the speed with which it comes through is dramatically slowed down, and that's the processing speed. The information still gets through, but it takes a whole lot longer, and it's kind of exhausting. It's very tedious. And so, folks with that kind of cognitive profile tend to get really dragged down. It can really contribute to anxiety. It can contribute to depression, loss of motivation academically, because I seem like I get this stuff, but then it just doesn't stick with me. And so, working memory comes into play as well. So we tend to see folks with a lot of those sorts of challenges, and that's that interplay again with executive functioning and ADHD and neurocognitive profiles.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then we've got a memory cluster, the working memory and accessing recall. We've spoken, a fair bit about this, especially because it tends to, where a lot of these things kind of influence one another. But just again, working memory, that information that you kind of, hold long enough to use. This can be really challenging when trying to work through, especially like a math class, something like that, especially, maybe a statistics class or a type of problem solving that requires several steps, and you have to hold the information in your brain for several steps. And that can be frustrating and kind of cause folks to make more errors as they go, and perhaps they're, transposing a number from one part of a problem to the next, incorrectly. So working memory, it's not short-term memory, but it could be sometimes more helpful to think of it in that way, because it's a little bit of information that you're trying to hold long enough to use. Another area where this can be frustrating is taking instructions and then following those instructions through, whether it be for a paper, something, an assignment in class, a task that was given, that kind of thing. As a teacher, gives 6 directions and kind of expects perhaps the class to follow them. Somebody with that working memory deficit might really struggle with remembering the first thing or the second thing, or they might remember the first thing but then forget where to go after that, and kind of feeling over the place and frustrated and perhaps a little embarrassed by that.
Yeah. I think, so some of the implications with virtual learning, with students not being able to return to the class, part of what helps folks with this profile be successful academically is making a strong personal connection with their teachers, with their professors. And that's happening a whole lot less with online classes, with virtual, with, just being given assignments that you then have to turn in online. There's just a whole lot more emphasis placed on self-regulation, self-motivation, time frames, all that sort of stuff. So, this whole pandemic, I think, has really academically challenged folks with this sort of cognitive profile.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I think of, a live class taking place, a live lecture, and, the space to be able to stop and ask questions, and ask for something to perhaps be repeated or broken down a little further, may be far more challenging, remotely rather than in person. And the ability to perhaps, take those kind of directions and, if something was missed, being able to observe others and kind of catch on from there. There's less ability to lean on other strengths that they may have, and more kind of, and it makes it a little bit easier to kind of withdraw and just be silent and try to just kind of get to the other end of things, which gets you to the other end of things, but perhaps not so successfully.
Right.
The last piece here, monitoring and self-regulation, these, kind of emotional regulation, self-control pieces, think about impulsivity in this as well. And this, may have the implications around, making a sudden decision not to log on for class. But there's also a lot of kind of social relationships that can be kind of frustrated by this, by not being able to self-monitor and exercise self-control in social situations. And it's I think again about kind of the pandemic atmosphere that we're in, and it's tough to even even think about how that might really play out. I don't know, Andy, you got anything off the top of your head for that one?
But again, there are all kinds of peripheral issues related to being successful as a student. One of them is social interactions. And so self-monitoring. There are many different profiles for individuals with ADHD, but some of them are really quite gregarious and socially connect. One of the theories is the prefrontal lobes are underdeveloped and require more stimulation for somebody with ADHD. And so what can happen is they're that type that's sort of poking the environment with a stick all the time, just sort of getting a reaction back that's activating for them. Well, what happens is they don't always read the room very well and don't recognize when they've taken it too far and their peers have had enough. And then they sort of act surprised and hurt when they get a negative response to it. So some of that is that self monitoring, the impulsivity, and it can really have an impact in terms of what's going on in the classroom as well.
Yeah. Yeah, with the pandemic atmosphere that we're in, it's tough to say how how those social interactions will really will present themselves and play out this fall semester for folks. That'll be an interesting one.
Right, right.
Well, I think that just about covers the material we had for today.
Okay. As always, folks, if you have any questions, comments, please email us. We would love to share the input that we get from parents and expand on the conversation more. And we can certainly share any feedback we get with the next time we meet, which will be sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know that we've identified a specific night yet. Um, so, Austin, thank you for joining me tonight. I appreciate it, and thank you all for joining us as well. We appreciate you putting in the time on behalf of your young adult children that we are thrilled to be working with. So, evening, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks.